He preached on Sunday. They found the bodies on Tuesday. That's how the newspapers would eventually report it. Clean. Simple. A headline designed to sell papers and generate clicks. But headlines don't tell you about the silence. They don't tell you about the way the wind stopped blowing through Millbrook County on that particular Sunday morning, or how the birds seemed to vanish from the sky during his sermon. They don't tell you about Sarah Whitmore's hands trembling as she clutched her hymnal in the third pew, or how she knew, somewhere deep in the ancient part of her brain that still remembers when humans were prey, that something was profoundly wrong. Before we descend into the darkness of this tale, I need you to do something for me. If you're ready to uncover a story that will chill you to your very core, hit that subscribe button right now. Click the notification bell, because you won't want to miss what comes next. And if you know someone brave enough to handle this truth, share this with them. Trust me, you'll want to talk about this afterward. Now, let's begin. Let me take you back. Back to that Sunday. Back to before the bodies. Back to when Millbrook was still a town where people slept with their doors unlocked and children played in the streets until the streetlights flickered on. Reverend Marcus Thorne had been the pastor of Millbrook Community Church for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Not that anyone was counting. Not that anyone had reason to count. He was, by all accounts, exactly what a small town needed. 38 years old, handsome in that wholesome, trustworthy way that made mothers relax and fathers nod approvingly. His wife, Elizabeth, was the picture of grace. Blonde, soft-spoken, always first to volunteer for the bake sale, the food drive, the children's Sunday school. They'd arrived from somewhere out west. Colorado, Marcus had said. Or was it Wyoming? The details were always slightly hazy, but no one really pressed. Small towns are hungry for good people, and the Thornes seemed like good people. Great people, even. Marcus had a way of preaching that made you feel seen. Not judged, but seen. He'd look out over the congregation with those deep brown eyes, and it was like he could peer straight into your soul and find the good parts you'd forgotten were there. He talked about redemption like he understood it intimately. About forgiveness like he'd needed it himself. About the darkness in all of us, and how the light could still break through. People loved him for it. But that Sunday, the last Sunday, something was different. Sarah Whitmore felt it first. She'd been attending services at Millbrook Community Church for 43 years, ever since she was a girl in pigtails sitting beside her mother. She knew the rhythms of worship like she knew her own heartbeat. And that morning, the rhythm was wrong. Marcus took the pulpit at exactly 10:47 a.m., same as always. The choir had just finished, "How Great Thou Art," their voices still echoing off the wooden rafters. But when Marcus gripped the edges of the pulpit, his knuckles went white. Not slightly pale, bone white. Like he was holding on to keep from falling into an abyss only he could see. "Good morning, beloved," he said, and his voice was steady. Too steady. Like a man reading from a script he'd memorized under duress. Sarah watched as Elizabeth, sitting in her usual spot in the front pew, didn't look up at her husband. Elizabeth, who normally gazed at Marcus with such obvious adoration that it sometimes embarrassed the teenagers in the youth group. That morning, Elizabeth's eyes were fixed on her hands, folded so tightly in her lap that Sarah could see the tendons standing out like ropes. "Today," Marcus continued, "I want to talk to you about sacrifice. A normal enough topic. Biblical. Expected. But the way he said the word sacrifice made it sound like a confession. We talk a lot in church about what we're willing to give up for our faith. Our time. Our money. Our comfort. We put bills in the collection plate and we volunteer for the mission trip and we feel good about ourselves. We feel righteous." He paused. The silence stretched out like taffy, thin and uncomfortable. But that's not real sacrifice, is it? That's just convenience. We sacrifice what we can afford to lose. We give up what doesn't really cost us anything. Old Tom Fletcher, sitting in the back pew like he had every Sunday for 60 years, shifted uncomfortably. Something in Marcus's tone was making his combat veteran instincts prickle. He'd heard that tone before, in the voice of a man who'd made a decision no one else could understand. A soldier who'd volunteered for a suicide mission. That eerie calm of someone who'd moved past fear into a territory that had no name. Real sacrifice, Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, yet somehow everyone could hear him perfectly. Real sacrifice is when you give up what you love most. What you can't bear to lose. When you put it on the altar and you light the match yourself. Elizabeth's hands were shaking now. Sarah could see it even from 3 rows back. Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac. His son. His beloved son. God asked. And Abraham raised the knife. Marcus's hand moved, mimicking the motion of raising a blade. That's faith. That's trust. That's understanding that sometimes the Lord requires everything from us. Not most things. Everything. Jenny Martinez, who'd brought her 2 young daughters to church, Sophie, age 6, and Lily, age 4, felt a cold finger trace down her spine. She pulled her girls closer, one under each arm. Sophie squirmed, but Jenny held firm. I wonder, Marcus continued, his eyes now roaming over the congregation with an intensity that made people want to look away but found they couldn't. I wonder how many of us truly have that kind of faith. How many of us would do what Abraham did if God asked? If God really, truly asked. Pastor Henderson, the elderly minister emeritus who sometimes still attended services, cleared his throat loudly from his wheelchair in the side alcove. It was a pointed sound. A warning. But Marcus didn't acknowledge it. The Bible tells us that God stopped Abraham's hand at the last moment. The knife didn't fall. Isaac was spared. A ram appeared in the thicket, and that was sacrificed instead. Marcus smiled, but it was wrong. All wrong. Like someone had told him what a smile was supposed to look like, but had never actually seen one. But what if there was no ram? What if Abraham had to go through with it? Would that have made his faith less? Or more? Elizabeth stood up. Just stood, sudden and graceless, her purse falling from her lap and spilling contents across the wooden floor. Lipstick, keys, tissues, a pill bottle that rattled as it rolled down the aisle. Everyone watched it roll. No one moved to stop it. I'm sorry, Elizabeth whispered, though her voice carried in the shocked silence. I'm not feeling well. Please excuse me. She walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the floor like a countdown. Marcus watched her go, his expression unreadable. He waited until the heavy door closed behind her before continuing. Love requires sacrifice, he said softly. Real love. The deepest love. And sacrifice requires death. That's when people started to feel it in their stomachs. That sick, twisting feeling that something was very wrong. But social conditioning is a powerful thing. You don't just stand up and walk out of church during a sermon, even when every instinct is screaming at you to run. You sit. You endure. You tell yourself you're misunderstanding. I want to share something with you all, Marcus said. A confession, if you will. When Elizabeth and I came to Millbrook 3 years ago, we were running. Running from something terrible. Something that had broken us. Now he had their complete attention. The truth has gravity. It pulls you in whether you want it to or not. We had a daughter. Her name was Grace. She was 7 years old, with blonde hair like her mother and eyes that looked like they could see heaven itself. His voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to sound human. She was perfect. She was everything. And she died. Gasps rippled through the congregation. This was new information. The Thornes had never mentioned a child. Leukemia, Marcus continued. Aggressive. Fast. We prayed. God, how we prayed. We begged. We bargained. We made promises. Do you know what God said to our prayers? The question hung in the air, rhetorical and terrible. Nothing. God said nothing. Grace died in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and despair, and God was silent. Sarah's eyes were filling with tears. Around her, she could hear others crying too. This was grief. Raw, real, devastating grief. You couldn't fake this. We lost our faith that day, Marcus said. Completely. Utterly. We were hollow shells walking around in the shapes of people. Elizabeth stopped speaking for 3 months. I would wake up in the middle of the night and find her standing in Grace's empty bedroom. Just standing. Staring at the bed where our daughter used to sleep. He gripped the pulpit again, that white-knuckled grip. And then, one night, God spoke to me. For the first time since Grace died, I heard his voice. Clear as I'm speaking to you now. And do you know what he said? No one breathed. The church was so silent you could have heard a mouse whisper. He said, "Your faith was weak. Your prayers were selfish. You wanted me to spare what you loved, but you never asked what I required." And I understood finally what Abraham must have felt. The terrible, beautiful clarity of understanding that God demands everything. Not almost everything. Everything. Tom Fletcher stood up. Slowly, deliberately, his old knees protesting. "Reverend Thorne," he said, his voice rough with age and authority, "I think maybe we should end the service here. You're upset. You're grieving. We all understand that." Marcus looked at him, and Tom Fletcher, who'd survived Normandy Beach, who'd seen horrors that still woke him at night 70 years later, felt afraid. "Sit down, Tom," Marcus said gently. "I'm almost finished." And Tom Fletcher, God help him, sat down. "I've been wrestling with God for 3 years," Marcus said. "Wrestling like Jacob with the angel. Demanding to understand. Demanding to know why he took Grace. And last week, he finally gave me the answer. He showed me what he requires. What real faith looks like. What true sacrifice means." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. He held it up for everyone to see, though most people were too far away to make out the details. But Sarah could see it. Sarah had good eyes. It was a picture of 3 people. Marcus, Elizabeth, and between them, holding both their hands, a little blonde girl with a smile that could light up the world. "This is Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is what I loved most. This is what I lost. And this is what helped me understand." He placed the photograph on the pulpit, smoothing it carefully. "God took Grace to test my faith, and I failed. I cursed him. I turned away. But now I understand. It wasn't enough to lose her once. That was passive. That was just enduring what was taken. Real faith requires active sacrifice. It requires me to give, not just to lose." Jenny Martinez stood up, pulling her daughters with her. "We're leaving," she announced to no one in particular, pushing past the other people in her pew. Several families followed her lead. The spell was breaking. But Marcus kept talking, his voice rising to reach them. "Elizabeth and I, we decided. Together. We decided to show God we understand now. We decided to make the sacrifice he requires. To prove our faith is strong enough. To prove we love him more than we love anything else." The door was opening, closing, opening again as people fled. But some remained, paralyzed by horror and morbid fascination. "We don't have Grace anymore," Marcus said, and now his voice was breaking completely, tears streaming down his face. "We can't sacrifice what we've already lost. So we had to find something else. Something precious. Something that would hurt to give up. Something that would prove our faith is real." Sarah Whitmore was moving toward the exit now, her elderly legs carrying her faster than they had in years. Behind her, she could hear Marcus still speaking. "The Lord will understand. He has to understand. This is what he asked for. This is what Abraham would have done if there had been no ram. This is real faith. This is..." His voice cut off abruptly. Sarah glanced back and saw Pastor Henderson had wheeled himself to the pulpit and physically pulled the microphone away. "This service is over," the old pastor said, his voice shaking but firm. "Everyone go home. Now." Sarah made it outside into the sunshine that seemed too bright, too cheerful for what had just happened. People were clustered in small groups on the lawn, speaking in urgent whispers, pulling out cell phones. Elizabeth's car was gone from the parking lot. She'd fled. Marcus emerged from the church a few minutes later, escorted by Pastor Henderson and Tom Fletcher, one on each side. He looked dazed, confused, like a man waking from a dream. He mumbled. I don't know what. Did I say something wrong? You need help, son, Pastor Henderson said quietly. Real help. We're going to call someone. But Marcus pulled away from them, stumbling toward his own car. No, I need to get home. I need to check on Elizabeth. She wasn't feeling well. I need to make sure she's okay. Marcus, Tom started, but the younger man was already in his car, engine starting, pulling out of the lot faster than was safe. Sarah watched him go, and that cold finger traced her spine again. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. But she didn't know what. Not yet. None of them did. Not until Tuesday. The rest of Sunday passed in a blur of phone calls and worried conversations. Pastor Henderson called the church board for an emergency meeting. Several congregation members called mental health crisis lines, unsure what to do. Jenny Martinez called her sister, who was a social worker, asking if there was any way to have someone checked on for a psychiatric emergency. But small towns move slow. It was Sunday. The crisis center said they'd send someone out first thing Monday morning. The church board scheduled their meeting for Monday evening. Everyone told themselves it could wait until tomorrow. Marcus Thorne's house sat at the end of Birchwood Lane, a quiet street lined with maples that turned brilliant red in the fall. It was a nice house. 2 stories, white siding, black shutters, a porch with a swing that Elizabeth had hung herself. The kind of house where happy families lived. The lights were on inside. Neighbors reported later that they'd seen Marcus arrive home around noon, his car pulling into the garage. The garage door had closed behind him. That was normal. That was fine. No one saw Elizabeth's car, but that wasn't unusual. She often parked in the garage too, or sometimes she went out for drives when she needed to clear her head. She'd been doing that more lately, people said in hindsight. Long drives to nowhere in particular. Sunday night passed quietly on Birchwood Lane. Monday morning came. The crisis counselor called the Thorne residence. No answer. She left a message on the machine, her voice cheerful and professional, asking Marcus to call her back when he got a chance. He didn't call back. Pastor Henderson tried calling Monday afternoon. The phone rang and rang. He drove by the house. The garage door was closed. Everything looked normal. He almost knocked on the door but hesitated. What would he say? Maybe Marcus was embarrassed about his breakdown. Maybe he needed space. Henderson decided to give him until the evening board meeting, see if Marcus showed up. Marcus didn't show up. By Monday night, people were getting worried. Tom Fletcher, who'd lived on Birchwood Lane for 40 years, 2 houses down from the Thornes, mentioned to his wife that he hadn't seen any movement at the house all day. No lights turning on or off. No car leaving or arriving. Nothing. Maybe they went away, his wife suggested. Maybe they needed to get out of town after yesterday. It made sense. People nodded along with that theory. Yes, they'd probably left town for a few days. Needed to clear their heads. Deal with some obviously unresolved trauma. They'd be back. Tuesday morning dawned grey and cold. October weather, the kind that hints at the winter coming. At 8:47 a.m., Margaret Chen from the power company knocked on the Thornes' door. There'd been a report of a possible electrical issue in the neighborhood, fluctuating voltage that could indicate a problem. She needed to check the meter and possibly come inside to look at the breaker box. She knocked 3 times. No answer. She walked around to the back of the house to check the meter. The back door was unlocked. Unusual, but not unheard of. Small town life. Hello, she called, poking her head inside. Mr. Thorne? Mrs. Thorne? It's Margaret from the power company. I need to check your breaker box. The house was silent. But not the good kind of silent. The wrong kind. The kind of silence that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Margaret stepped inside. The kitchen was clean. Spotless, actually. Counters wiped down, dishes put away. Floor freshly mopped. It smelled like bleach and lemon cleaner. Hello, she called again, louder this time. That's when she noticed the basement door. It was open, just a crack. And there was a smell underneath the lemon cleaner. Faint, but getting stronger. Copper and meat and something else. Something organic and wrong. Margaret Chen had worked for the power company for 15 years. She'd been in a lot of basements. She knew what a dead animal smelled like. Raccoons in the walls, mice in the traps. That one time a deer had somehow gotten into someone's crawl space and died there. This wasn't that. But she had a job to do, and the breaker box was probably in the basement, and she was a professional. So she opened the door fully and started down the stairs. The lights were off. She fumbled for the switch, found it, flipped it on. What she saw at the bottom of those stairs would require years of therapy to even begin to process. She screamed. Scrambled back up the stairs, nearly falling in her panic. Got outside. Called 911, her voice so high and broken that the dispatcher almost couldn't understand her. There are bodies, she kept saying. Oh God, oh Jesus, there are bodies. In the basement. Multiple bodies. Please send someone. Please send everyone. The first police car arrived 6 minutes later. Officer Jake Reeves, 26 years old, 2 years on the force. The most exciting thing he dealt with in Millbrook was a drunk and disorderly at the county fair last summer. He found Margaret Chen sitting on the front lawn, rocking back and forth, her phone still clutched in her hand. Ma'am, what did you see? She just pointed at the house and shook her head. Jake approached carefully, hand on his weapon though he didn't draw it. Through the open back door, into the too-clean kitchen, toward the basement stairs. He made it 3 steps down before he saw them. He threw up. Right there on the stairs. Couldn't help it. Then he radioed for backup, his voice shaking so badly he had to repeat himself twice. By 10 a.m., Birchwood Lane was swarming with police cars, ambulances, the county sheriff, the medical examiner, and what seemed like every law enforcement officer in 3 counties. By 10:30 a.m., the news vans had arrived. By noon, the story was going national. He preached on Sunday. They found the bodies on Tuesday. But that headline didn't tell you what they found. It didn't tell you about the basement that had been converted into something between a church and an altar and an abattoir. It didn't tell you about the candles, hundreds of them, burned down to stubs, wax pooled on every surface. It didn't tell you about the Bible, open to Genesis chapter 22, the story of Abraham and Isaac, with certain passages highlighted in what forensics would later confirm was human blood. It didn't tell you about the bodies. There were 4 of them. Elizabeth Thorne, age 36. Found in a kneeling position, hands folded in prayer, a gunshot wound to the back of her head. Execution style, the Me would later report. Professional. Clean. Death would have been instantaneous. The Hendersons. Not Pastor Henderson, his son, David Henderson, age 42, and David's wife, Claire, age 40. David was a deacon at the church. Claire taught Sunday school. They had 3 kids, all teenagers, all at various friends' houses on a sleepover that Saturday night. Thank God. Thank God for small mercies. David and Claire had been bound to chairs, positioned facing each other. Multiple stab wounds on both bodies. Defensive wounds on David's hands. He'd tried to fight. Tried to protect Claire. It hadn't been enough. And Marcus Thorne himself, age 38, found in the center of the basement, lying on his back in a pool of his own blood, arms spread wide like a crucifixion. Self-inflicted wounds to both wrists. Deep, deliberate cuts. Beside him, a knife. On his chest, a note written in his own blood. The note said, "Now do you understand? Now do you see my faith? I gave you everything. Everything. Please. Please let me see her again. Please tell me this was enough." The forensics team worked through Tuesday into Wednesday. The timeline they reconstructed was horrifying in its premeditation. Saturday night, late, Marcus invited David and Claire Henderson over to discuss a private matter. David had mentioned it to his eldest daughter before leaving, said Marcus sounded upset, needed to talk about something important. The daughter was 17, old enough to stay home with her younger siblings during the sleepover. David and Claire never came home. Sometime Saturday night into early Sunday morning, Marcus killed David and Claire Henderson in his basement. The amount of blood, the evidence of struggle, the way the bodies were positioned, it took hours. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was ritual. Sunday morning, early, Elizabeth woke to find her husband covered in blood, standing over 2 dead bodies in their basement. Investigators found her fingerprints on the basement door, the light switch, the railing. She'd gone down there. She'd seen. Marcus had given her a choice, they theorized. They'd never know for sure, but the evidence suggested she'd had time to run, to call for help, to escape. But her car was in the garage. Her purse was in the house. Her phone showed no outgoing calls after Saturday evening. Instead, she'd gotten dressed for church. She'd put on her nice dress, her pearls, her shoes. She'd gone to church with her husband, knowing what was in their basement. Knowing what he'd done. Maybe she was in shock. Maybe she was coerced. Maybe, and this was the theory that made the investigators lose sleep, maybe she believed him. Maybe some part of her, broken by grief over grace, twisted by shared trauma, thought that maybe this was what God wanted. That maybe this sacrifice would bring their daughter back. They'd never know. Elizabeth took her secrets to the grave. Sunday after the church service, Elizabeth had driven away. The evidence showed she'd gone to the pharmacy, purchased sleeping pills, driven home, taken the pills, gone to the basement, knelt down next to her husband, and waited. Marcus had shot her while she was unconscious or barely conscious. Then he'd arranged her body, positioned her just so, lit more candles, read passages from the Bible out loud. Neighbors reported hearing what sounded like someone speaking in the Thorne house Sunday afternoon, but couldn't make out the words. Then he'd completed his sacrifice. The cuts to his wrists were deep and sure. He'd known what he was doing. He'd positioned himself exactly where he wanted to be found. And he'd waited to bleed out, which would have taken 15 to 20 minutes, during which he remained conscious enough to write his final message. He died Sunday night, sometime around 9 p.m., the medical examiner estimated. And no one knew. For almost 2 full days, the Henderson children were calling their parents, getting voicemail, telling themselves Mom and Dad would call back soon. The church board was debating what to do about Marcus. The congregation was gossiping about his breakdown. Sarah Whitmore was losing sleep, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. And all that time, 4 bodies were cooling in that basement. The investigation that followed was both massive and, in some ways, anticlimactic. This wasn't a mystery. There were no other suspects. The evidence was overwhelming and clear. Marcus Thorne had murdered David and Claire Henderson, coerced or convinced his wife Elizabeth to participate in a murder-suicide, and then killed himself. But the why was what haunted everyone. Detectives dug into the Thornes' past. They found Grace's death certificate. It was all true. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, diagnosed at age 6, dead at 7. The hospital records showed exactly what Marcus had described. Parents frantic with prayer and desperation, a child wasting away despite every treatment available. They found the Thornes' previous address in Colorado. Talked to people who'd known them. A neighbor remembered Elizabeth standing in Grace's room for hours, exactly like Marcus had described. A former pastor recalled Marcus becoming increasingly angry at God, shouting during prayer sessions, demanding answers. He kept asking why God had taken his daughter but left other children alive, the pastor told detectives. Children who were abused, neglected, unloved. He couldn't understand why Grace, who was so precious and so wanted, had to die while children who weren't wanted got to live. It was eating him alive. The pastor had recommended therapy. Marcus had refused. Said therapy was for people who didn't have faith. He had faith. He just needed God to answer him. Apparently, God eventually did. Or at least, Marcus believed he did. Psychiatrists who reviewed the case posthumously diagnosed Marcus with a psychotic break, likely triggered by unresolved grief and complicated by what might have been underlying mental illness. The delusion that God was speaking to him, commanding sacrifice, was consistent with religious psychosis. But diagnoses didn't bring anyone back. Didn't comfort the Henderson children, who'd lost their parents to a madman's delusion. Didn't help the congregation process what had happened in their church, to their pastor, right in front of them. Sarah Whitmore would tell anyone who'd listen that she'd felt it. That Sunday morning, she'd known something was wrong. But knowing and acting are different things. She lay awake nights wondering if she could have done something differently. If she'd stood up during the sermon, made a scene, called the police right then, would it have mattered? The Hendersons were already dead by then. But maybe Elizabeth would still be alive. Tom Fletcher had similar thoughts. He'd almost tackled Marcus that Sunday, after the sermon. Almost physically restrained him. His combat instincts had been screaming at him that Marcus was dangerous. But you can't arrest someone for giving a disturbing sermon. You can't lock someone up for seeming unstable during a church service. The Henderson children, Amanda, 17, Tyler, 15, and Emma, 13, had to go live with their aunt in Nebraska. The aunt told reporters they were as okay as could be expected, which was to say not okay at all. How do you explain to children that their parents were murdered by their pastor? That their Sunday school teacher had been complicit in her own death? That God, who they'd been taught loved them, had, in their pastor's sick mind, demanded their parents' deaths? Emma stopped speaking for 4 months. Tyler got in 3 fights at his new school in the first week. Amanda started self-harming. The aunt was doing her best, but how do you parent through that kind of trauma? The Millbrook Community Church never recovered. They tried to keep services going, with guest pastors, with lay leaders, with determination and prayer and a refusal to let evil win. But attendance dropped. People couldn't walk into that building without thinking about Marcus's final sermon. About what he'd said. About what he'd already done by the time he said it. The church closed 18 months after the murders. The building sat empty for a while, then was bought by a developer and converted into condos. Sometimes the new residents report hearing things, footsteps where there shouldn't be any, voices in the walls, crying in the middle of the night. But that might just be the way old buildings settle. The way pipes creak. The way the wind sounds when it's blowing just right. Or it might not be. I've spent months researching this case. Reading every police report I could access through FOIA requests. Interviewing people who were there that Sunday. Sitting in the coffee shop in Millbrook, the one that's still open, barely. Listening to people who lived through it share their stories in quiet voices. One thing that keeps coming up, that everyone mentions, is the sermon. That last sermon. People who were there can still recite parts of it verbatim. It's burned into their memories like a brand. Real sacrifice is when you give up what you love most. The Lord requires everything from us. Not most things. Everything. Sacrifice requires death. He was telling them what he'd done. Confessing in his own twisted way. Explaining his reasoning. Seeking, what? Absolution. Understanding. Witnesses to his faith. Whatever he was seeking, he didn't find it. What he found was a basement floor, bleeding out, alone with his delusions and his dead. The thing that haunts me most about this case isn't the violence, though God knows that's haunting enough. It's the fact that Marcus Thorne genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. In his broken mind, Warped by grief and psychosis, he thought he was showing God the depth of his faith. He thought he was proving something. He'd failed God once, when Grace died and he cursed heaven. He wasn't going to fail again. This time, he'd give God everything. Everything. And what he gave was 4 lives, destroyed in the name of a deity who never asked for them. There's a theological question at the heart of this that churches struggled with in the aftermath. The story of Abraham and Isaac. Was it about faith or about cruelty? Was God testing Abraham's devotion or demonstrating that he doesn't actually want human sacrifice? The traditional interpretation is clear. God stopped Abraham's hand. Provided the ram. The point wasn't that Abraham should kill his son, but that he should be willing to. That his faith should be absolute, even in the face of the unthinkable. But Marcus took it a step further. He asked, what if there is no ram? What if God asks and doesn't provide an out? What if the sacrifice is required, not just the willingness? It's a question that has no good answer. Because if God truly demanded such things, what kind of God would that be? And if he doesn't demand such things, then why tell the story at all? Why put it in the Bible as an example of faith? These are the questions that theological scholars debated after the Thorne murders. These are the sermons that pastors across the country preached, trying to make sense of senseless violence, trying to reassure their congregations that God is good, that faith doesn't require blood, that Marcus Thorne was simply, tragically, completely wrong. But I wonder if they convinced anyone. I wonder if the people listening could truly believe it, knowing what had happened in Millbrook. Knowing that a man who preached God's love on Sunday had murdered in God's name by Tuesday. I spoke with Dr. Helen Winters, a psychiatrist who specializes in religious psychosis. She didn't treat Marcus Thorne, he never sought treatment, but she reviewed his case at my request. What you have to understand, she told me, is that religious delusions are particularly dangerous because they provide both motivation and justification. In Marcus's mind, he wasn't committing murder. He was performing a holy act. The same brain chemistry that can produce profound spiritual experiences can, when unbalanced, produce profound spiritual psychosis. She showed me brain scans of patients experiencing religious delusions. The same areas that light up during prayer and meditation were hyperactive. The same sense of connection to something greater, the same feeling of absolute certainty. It was all there. But twisted. Turned inward. Eating the person from the inside out. Marcus likely experienced what felt like genuine divine communication, Dr. Winters explained. His brain was producing it. To him, it was as real as you and me sitting here talking. Maybe more real. When you believe God is literally speaking to you, telling you what to do, questioning it feels like the ultimate sin. Like betraying everything you hold sacred. I asked her if there were warning signs. Things that could have indicated Marcus was heading toward violence. She sighed. In hindsight, yes. The obsession with sacrifice. The inability to process his daughter's death. The increasing isolation. People who knew them said the Thornes had been withdrawing socially in the months before the murders. Elizabeth had stopped going to her book club. Marcus had cancelled several counseling sessions with church members, claiming he was too busy. They were pulling inward, into their shared delusion. Shared delusion. I asked, you think Elizabeth believed it too? Dr. Winters hesitated. I think she wanted to believe it. I think she was so desperate to see her daughter again, so broken by grief, that when Marcus told her God had given them a way to prove their faith, a way that might, in some cosmic transaction, bring Grace back, part of her wanted it to be true. Even if that meant becoming complicit in murder. It's chilling to think about. Elizabeth Thorne, by all accounts a kind, gentle woman, a Sunday school teacher, someone who baked cookies for the youth group and always remembered everyone's birthday. That woman kneeling in a basement next to 2 murdered bodies, waiting for her husband to execute her, believing maybe, just maybe, this was the path to seeing her daughter again. Grief can break you in ways that make you unrecognizable to yourself. The Henderson children, Amanda, Tyler, and Emma, they're adults now. I reached out to Amanda, the eldest. She's 29 now, married, with a child of her own. She declined to be interviewed for this, but she did send me an email. I've thought about her words every day since. People always want to know if I've forgiven him, she wrote. Marcus Thorne. If I've found peace. If my faith survived. They want a neat ending to the horror story. They want me to say that yes, I've forgiven, because that's what you're supposed to do. That's what Christians do, right? But I haven't. I can't. Every major milestone in my life, graduation, my wedding, the birth of my son, I feel their absence like a physical wound. My parents should have been there. My mom should have held her grandson. My dad should have walked me down the aisle. Marcus Thorne took that from me. He took everything. And for what? For some twisted idea of faith that exists nowhere except in his sick mind? For a God who never asked for it, never wanted it, never would have condoned it? I don't go to church anymore. I can't. The last time I was in a church was my parents' funeral. 12 years ago. The pastor talked about God's plan and how we can't understand it, but we have to have faith. And all I could think was, this was God's plan? My parents murdered by a lunatic? That's the plan? If that's God's plan, I want no part of it. So no, I haven't forgiven Marcus Thorne. And I probably never will. And I'm okay with that. Some things are unforgivable. Some breaks don't heal. And maybe that's okay too. I include this not to suggest that Amanda is right or wrong in her unforgiveness. That's not for me, or anyone, to judge. I include it because it's honest. It's real. And it's a perspective that often gets ignored in stories like this, where we want redemption arcs and healing journeys and faith restored. Sometimes there is no redemption. Sometimes the wounds don't heal. Sometimes the faith doesn't survive. And sometimes that's just the truth of it. In the years since the murders, Millbrook has tried to move on. The population has actually grown slightly. Young families moving in, attracted by affordable housing prices, not knowing or not caring about the town's dark history. Life continues. But there are markers, if you know where to look. The old church building, now condos, has a plaque that mentions it was once a place of worship. It doesn't mention why the church closed. The Henderson children's names are on a memorial bench in the town park. It doesn't say how they lost their parents. Birchwood Lane looks just like any other suburban street. The house where it happened was sold, renovated, sold again. A young couple lives there now with their twin toddlers. I drove by once. Saw the kids playing in the yard. Heard their laughter. The mother was watching them from the porch swing. The same swing Elizabeth Thorne used to sit on. Does the new family know what happened in their basement? Maybe. Maybe not. The realtor wasn't legally required to disclose it, not after enough time had passed, not after enough renovations. But sometimes, the mother told a neighbor, she hears things. Footsteps in the basement when everyone's upstairs. The smell of candles when none are lit. A feeling of being watched. The neighbor suggested it was probably just the house settling. Old pipes. Active imagination. The mother agreed. Probably. But she doesn't go in the basement anymore. Keeps it locked. Stores nothing down there. Just in case. I want to return to that Sunday. That last sermon. Because I think there's something important there that we haven't fully examined. When Marcus stood in that pulpit and talked about sacrifice, about Abraham and Isaac, about faith requiring everything, he wasn't just confessing what he'd done. He was asking permission. Seeking validation. He was looking out at that congregation, at those people who'd listened to him for 3 years, who'd trusted him, who'd invited him into their lives and their spiritual journeys. And he was asking, do you understand? Can you see it? Is my faith strong enough now? And the congregation, horrified and confused but still bound by politeness and social conditioning, stayed seated. Listened. Didn't call the police. Didn't physically restrain him when he tried to leave. I've thought a lot about that. About how easy it is to be a bystander to evil. How social norms and the desire to be polite can override every instinct screaming at you to act. Sarah Whitmore knew something was wrong. Tom Fletcher knew. Probably dozens of others felt it. But knowing isn't enough. Feeling isn't enough. Action is what matters. And no one acted. Not until it was too late. I'm not saying the congregation bears responsibility for the murders. They don't. Marcus Thorne alone made the choice to kill. But I'm saying that we, all of us as a society, need to get better at trusting our instincts. At speaking up when something feels wrong. At making a scene, risking embarrassment, calling for help. Because evil depends on silence. On complicity. On people telling themselves, it's probably nothing. And, I don't want to overreact. And, it's not my place to say something. It is your place. It's all of our place. When you see something wrong, you say something. Even if you're not sure. Even if you might be overreacting. Even if it makes you uncomfortable. Because the alternative is what happened in Millbrook. The alternative is bodies in a basement and children without parents, and a town that will never fully heal. There's one more piece of this story I need to tell you about. One more detail that still gives me chills when I think about it. The photograph Marcus held up during his sermon, the picture of him, Elizabeth, and Grace. The police found it in the basement. It was placed carefully on a small table, surrounded by candles, almost like a shrine. But here's the thing. The photograph had been altered. Someone, presumably Marcus, had drawn on it with a red marker. He'd drawn halos above all three heads. Grace's halo was bright and solid. Elizabeth's was faint, sketchy, uncertain. And his own halo was dripping. The red marker had been applied in such a way that the halo appeared to be bleeding, red drops falling from the circle above his head. Art therapy specialists who've looked at this image say it reveals Marcus's psychological state clearly. Grace was already in heaven. That was certain. Elizabeth's salvation was questionable, dependent on completing the sacrifice. And Marcus himself was contaminated, stained, bleeding. He knew on some level that what he was doing was wrong. But he believed the end justified the means. That the blood on his hands would wash away once God accepted his sacrifice and let him see Grace again. There's a profound sadness in that image. A man so broken by grief that he'd convinced himself murder was the path to redemption. A man so lost in his own mind that he couldn't see the truth. Grace was gone. No amount of blood, no demonstration of faith, no twisted sacrifice would bring her back. God doesn't work that way. The universe doesn't work that way. Death is final and permanent, and no amount of bargaining or violence or prayer can undo it. But Marcus couldn't accept that. So he created an alternative reality where maybe, just maybe, he could earn his daughter back. Could prove himself worthy. Could show God he was sorry for doubting, sorry for his weak faith, sorry for not understanding what was required. And in that alternative reality, murder made sense. Sacrifice made sense. Everything made sense except the one truth he couldn't face. She was gone and nothing could bring her back. I've been working on this story for 2 years now. Researching, interviewing, writing, rewriting. Trying to make sense of the senseless. Trying to find meaning in meaningless tragedy. And I've come to realize there might not be a meaning. Not every story has a moral. Not every tragedy teaches a lesson. Sometimes bad things just happen because human beings are fragile and complicated and capable of terrible things when grief and mental illness and delusion all collide in exactly the wrong way. Marcus Thorne wasn't a monster. That's the hardest part to accept. Monsters are easy. Monsters are other. Monsters are clearly evil from the start. But Marcus was a person. A grieving father. A man who loved his daughter so much that her death broke something fundamental inside him. A man who turned to God for comfort and, in his broken state, believed God was answering him. Believed God was asking for something terrible. And because he believed it so completely, because his faith was so absolute, he did it. That's the horror at the heart of this. Not that a monster committed evil, but that an ordinary man convinced himself that evil was holy. That murder was devotion. that taking lives was an act of love. And his wife believed him. Or wanted to believe him. Or was too broken to resist him. And that's horror too. The idea that grief can warp two people so completely that they become complicit in each other's worst impulses. That love, the thing that's supposed to save us, can instead drag us down together into darkness. There are questions I'll never have answers to. Things we'll never know for sure. Did Elizabeth really believe, or was she coerced? Was she a victim or a participant? Both. Neither. When did Marcus make the decision? Was it truly just last week, like he said in his sermon? Or had he been planning it for months, years even, waiting for God to tell him when and how? Why the Hendersons? Why David and Claire specifically? They weren't particularly close to the Thornes. They weren't best friends. They were just church members. Deacon and Sunday school teacher. Why them? The prevailing theory is that they were chosen precisely because they represented the church. The congregation. In Marcus's twisted logic, sacrificing church leaders was like sacrificing to the church, to God himself. But we'll never know for sure. And then there's the biggest question. What if someone had acted that Sunday? What if the police had been called? What if Marcus had been restrained, hospitalized, treated? Would the Hendersons and Elizabeth still be alive? Almost certainly yes. The timeline shows they died Sunday afternoon and evening. There was time. But you can't live in what-ifs. The Henderson children's aunt told me that, her voice weary with the wisdom of hard experience. We tortured ourselves with it for years. What if David had said no when Marcus invited them over? What if we'd insisted the kids stay home instead of doing sleepovers? What if? It doesn't help. It doesn't bring them back. At some point you have to accept that what happened, happened. And you can't change it. She's right, of course. But it doesn't make the what-ifs stop echoing. In the end, I think what happened in Millbrook is a story about grief. Not about evil or faith or madness, though those are all part of it, but about what grief can do to us when we don't process it healthily. When we don't get help. When we turn inward instead of outward. Marcus Thorne needed therapy. He needed medication. He needed a support system that could recognize his deteriorating mental health and intervene. He needed a lot of things he never got. And because he didn't get those things, 4 people died. It's as simple and as complicated as that. The sun is setting on Birchwood Lane as I write this. I'm sitting in my car, parked across from the house where it happened. The family with the twin toddlers is inside, probably making dinner, helping kids with homework, doing all the normal things that normal families do. The house looks peaceful. Ordinary. There's no sign of the horror that unfolded here. The basement has been completely renovated. I looked at the public records. New flooring, new walls, new everything. You could never tell what it used to be. But I know. The Henderson children know. Sarah Whitmore knows. Tom Fletcher knows. Everyone who was in that church that Sunday knows. And we carry it with us. A piece of darkness in an otherwise normal life. A reminder that evil can wear a kind face and speak in a gentle voice and stand in a pulpit and preach about love while planning murder. He preached on Sunday. They found the bodies on Tuesday. In between, a Sunday school class where Elizabeth Thorne taught children about Jesus' love. A Sunday dinner that Marcus and Elizabeth ate in silence. A Sunday evening where Marcus read his Bible and convinced himself one final time that what he was about to do was right, was holy, was necessary. A Monday where the crisis counselor couldn't reach them and assumed they'd gone away. Where neighbors noticed the quiet but assumed they needed privacy. Where the world continued on, unaware that just behind that closed door, in that sealed basement, 4 bodies were cooling. And then Tuesday. Margaret Chen. The scream. The police. The revelation. 2 days. That's all it took for a normal suburban street to become the site of tragedy. For a respected pastor to become a murderer. For a Sunday school teacher to become a victim. For 3 children to become orphans. 2 days. but the effects will last forever. I started this investigation thinking I'd find answers. That if I dug deep enough, interviewed enough people, read enough reports, I'd understand why this happened. I'd be able to explain it in a way that made sense. But I've learned that some things don't make sense. Can't make sense. Shouldn't make sense. What Marcus Thorne did was the act of a severely mentally ill man operating under the influence of psychotic delusions. There's no logic to unpack. No secret reason that would make it suddenly understandable. It was madness, pure and simple, dressed up in the language of faith. And recognizing it as madness doesn't mean we ignore the warning signs. Doesn't mean we stop asking questions about how we could do better as a society at identifying and helping people in crisis. But it does mean accepting that sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, despite all the systems we have in place, despite all the warning signs and red flags and concerned friends, sometimes tragedy still happens. And we're left to pick up the pieces and wonder if we could have done more. The answer, I think, is yes. We can always do more. We can be more vigilant, more willing to act on our instincts, more insistent on getting people help even when they resist. But we can't prevent every tragedy. We can't save everyone. And we have to live with that. As I prepare to leave Millbrook for the last time, having finished my research, conducted my final interviews, taken my last photographs of significant locations, I'm struck by how normal everything looks. The coffee shop is bustling. The park is full of kids playing. The high school football team is practicing on the field. Life goes on. And maybe that's the final lesson here. That even in the face of unthinkable horror, life continues. People adapt. Communities heal, slowly and imperfectly, but they heal. The Millbrook of today is not defined by what happened in 2024. It's defined by the people who stayed, who rebuilt, who refused to let tragedy be the final word. It's defined by the new families moving in, the businesses opening, the children being born who'll grow up never knowing firsthand about the murders, only hearing about them as dark local history. Time doesn't heal all wounds. Amanda Henderson's email makes that clear. But time does allow us to keep living alongside our wounds. To build new memories that don't contain the trauma. To find moments of joy even in the shadow of sorrow. The Henderson children are building lives. Sarah Whitmore still attends church, though not in Millbrook. Tom Fletcher still keeps an eye on his neighborhood, still trusts his instincts, still speaks up when something feels wrong. The congregation scattered to other churches, but many of them still practice their faith. Marcus Thorne didn't destroy these people. He hurt them, traumatized them, changed them forever. But he didn't destroy them. And maybe that's worth noting. In a story this dark, with this much pain, it's worth noting that the survivors survived. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. I'll close with this final thought, one that's been circling my mind since I started this project. We tell ourselves stories to make sense of the world. Stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. With heroes and villains. With lessons learned and morals drawn. But real life isn't a story. Real life is messy and complicated and often senseless. Bad things happen to good people for no reason. Grief breaks people in unpredictable ways. Mental illness manifests in ways we can't always see or treat. And sometimes, despite every warning sign, despite every opportunity to intervene, tragedy still unfolds. He preached on Sunday. They found the bodies on Tuesday. That's the story. That's what happened. But it's not the whole story. The whole story includes Grace Thorne, a 7-year-old girl who loved dinosaurs and wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. It includes David Henderson coaching his son's baseball team and Claire Henderson organizing the Churchcraft Fair. It includes Elizabeth Thorne's homemade cookies that everyone looked forward to at coffee hour. The whole story includes lives lived before they were ended. Love shared before it was twisted into something unrecognizable. Faith practiced earnestly before it was corrupted by delusion. We remember the horror because it's dramatic and shocking and impossible to forget. But we should also remember the ordinary goodness that came before. The normal lives that were interrupted by tragedy. Because that's the real loss here. Not just 4 deaths, but 4 lives that should have continued. Birthdays that won't be celebrated. Grandchildren who won't be held. Moments of laughter and love and ordinary happiness that were stolen. Marcus Thorne took those moments. Took them believing he was giving them to God as a sacrifice. But God didn't want them. Never wanted them. Never would have asked for them. What God wanted, what any decent theology teaches, was for Marcus to get help. To process his grief in healthy ways. To find healing and peace not through violence but through community, therapy, medication if needed, and time. But Marcus didn't do those things. And so a story that should have been about healing became a story about horror. The last person I interviewed for this project was Pastor Henderson, the elderly minister emeritus who'd been at the church that final Sunday. He's 94 now, his health failing, but his mind is still sharp. I think about it every day, he told me, his voice thin but steady. Every single day. I was right there. I could have stopped him from leaving. Could have physically blocked him. Could have called the police immediately instead of waiting to discuss it with the board. I started to say it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't have known, but he waved me off. I know what you're going to say. I've heard it 1,000 times. And intellectually, I know it's true. But knowing something in your head and feeling it in your heart are different things. And my heart still carries the weight of those deaths. He was quiet for a moment, staring out the window of his room at the assisted living facility. You know what haunts me most? Not the sermon itself, horrifying as it was. But after. When Marcus was getting into his car, he looked back at me. Made eye contact. And he smiled. Just a little smile. And in that moment, I saw it. I saw that he'd already done it. That the Hendersons were already dead. That Elizabeth had already made her choice. That it was already over. And I didn't know what I was seeing. Didn't understand. Just thought he was, I don't know, embarrassed. Trying to smooth things over. Wanting me to think he was okay. But he wasn't smoothing things over. He was saying goodbye. And I didn't realize it until Tuesday, when the bodies were found. And by then, he trailed off. Didn't need to finish the sentence. Do you still have faith? I asked quietly. He looked at me, and his eyes were wet but clear. Yes, he said. I do. But it's different now. More complicated. I can't simply believe that God has a plan and everything happens for a reason. Because if that's true, then what happened to my son and daughter-in-law was part of God's plan. And I can't accept that. I won't. So what do you believe? I believe God gave us free will. And free will means we can choose evil. Can choose madness. Can choose to hurt each other in terrible ways. And when we make those choices, people suffer. Innocents die. Families are destroyed. And God weeps with us. Grieves with us. But doesn't intervene. Can't intervene maybe, without removing that free will that makes us human in the first place. Is that enough for you? That explanation? He smiled sadly. It has to be. Because the alternative is to believe in a God who wanted my son and daughter-in-law murdered. And I can't worship that God. Won't worship that God. So I choose to believe in a God who gives us freedom and weeps when we misuse it. Who mourns every death and every act of violence. Who doesn't prevent these things but does offer comfort to those who suffer. It's not a perfect theology. But it's mine. It's what lets me sleep at night. Pastor Henderson died 3 weeks after that interview. Heart failure. Peaceful in his sleep. At his funeral, attended by what remained of the old Millbrook Community Church congregation, the new pastor, from a church across town, spoke about faith in the face of tragedy. He didn't mention the murders specifically. Didn't need to. Everyone there knew. Everyone carried the weight. But he talked about choosing faith despite suffering. About finding God not in explanations but in community. In the arms that hold you while you grieve. In the friends who sit with you in silence because there are no words. In the slow, painful work of rebuilding a life after it's been shattered. And I thought, yes, that's it. That's the closest thing to meaning I've found in all of this. Not in the murders themselves, those are meaningless, born of madness and delusion. But in what came after. In the way people showed up for each other. In the way the community rallied around the Henderson children. In the way Sarah Whitmore started a mental health awareness group at her new church. In the way Tom Fletcher now volunteers with crisis intervention teams, teaching people to trust their instincts and act on them. Meaning isn't in the tragedy. Meaning is in the response to tragedy. Marcus Thorne created horror. But he didn't create the final chapter. The survivors did that. They're still writing it, every day, choosing life over death, hope over despair, community over isolation. That's not redemption. What happened can't be redeemed. Those 4 lives can't be restored. But it's something. It's resistance against meaninglessness. It's the refusal to let evil have the last word. So that's the story. He preached on Sunday. They found the bodies on Tuesday. And in between, a tragedy unfolded that changed a town forever. If you've made it this far, I need to ask you something. What would you have done? If you'd been in that church that Sunday, listening to Marcus Thorne's sermon, feeling that wrongness in your gut, would you have acted? Would you have called the police? Would you have done something? I want you to think about that. Really think about it. Because the uncomfortable truth is that most of us like to believe we'd be the hero in that situation. But most of us, statistically, would do exactly what the congregation did. Feel uncomfortable, talk about it later, tell ourselves we'd handle it tomorrow. And tomorrow is sometimes too late. Before you go, do 3 things for me. First, subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell. Because I'm going to keep telling these stories. The ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones we need to hear. The ones that might, just might, prevent the next tragedy. Second, share this video. Not because I want views, but because someone in your life might need to hear it. Might be struggling with grief or mental illness. Might be ignoring warning signs in someone they know. This story could save a life. I truly believe that. Third, and this is the most important, if you or someone you know is struggling with grief, mental health issues, or thoughts of harming themselves or others, please get help. Call the Suicide Prevention Hotline. Talk to a therapist. Reach out to someone you trust. Don't suffer in silence. Don't let grief twist into something darker. Marcus Thorne's tragedy started with a loss he couldn't process and got no help for. It didn't have to end in murder. With proper intervention, proper support, proper treatment, those 4 people would still be alive. Your story doesn't have to end in tragedy either. Get help. Ask for help. Accept help when it's offered. And here's my question for you, the one I want you to answer in the comments. Do you think faith can survive tragedy? Or does something like this permanently break the connection between a person and their God? Can you still believe in a loving deity after witnessing or experiencing senseless evil? I want to hear your thoughts, your experiences, your stories. Because this isn't just about Millbrook. This is about all of us, trying to make sense of a world where terrible things happen and we're left to pick up the pieces. Thank you for listening. Thank you for making it through this with me. And remember, if you see something, say something. Trust your instincts. Act on your concerns. Don't wait until Tuesday to do what should have been done on Sunday. Because sometimes, the difference between tragedy and survival is just someone being willing to make a scene, to be uncomfortable, to do the hard thing even when it's awkward or embarrassing or might be an overreaction. Better to overreact and be wrong than to stay silent and be right. Stay safe out there. Take care of each other. And I'll see you in the next one.